near St. Louis on business today would not be able to be back for the meeting, so that can be recorded. Any additions? Oh, I guess we have approval of the minutes of the previous meeting.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion, a second. Any additions or corrections? Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any additions or corrections to the agenda this evening? Not see any. We'll go on to petitions and communications then. If there's anybody that would like to speak to the council this evening for a period of no more than 5 minutes, if you'll pick up one of these white cards in the back of the room and bring it up to myself or the clerk, you'll have a chance to do so. First, we have Rich Cahill. What is that, 307 South Orchard? On the topic of the MOR. After Rich will be Linda Lorenz.
Oh, I don't know. It's always better to go first or last. It's been many months since this process began. I've been to Preservation Commission meetings, Plan Commission meetings, probably every DRB meeting. And I think I would give staff a lot of credit for putting together a document that covers all sides. There's several issues that I live at 307 South Orchard, and two of my property lines border the MOR. And I've lived in that house for about 15 years. I was around when the whole process was talked about, the downtown to campus plan, and part of that people forget there was a lot of downzoning involved. So when I bought 307 South Orchard, it was probably R5, 6, and it went down back to R2. And so the whole plan has done a lot to preserve the character of High Street in particular. The DRB, as it was to review these different processes, didn't do anything for years, and suddenly it was a rush of 601, 611, and 605. If you drive up Green Street these days, you can see what 611 is turning into. And if you look at the architectural drawings on the little handout and what's starting to grow, there's something that you see the drawings until you actually see it. As you drive up Green Street to the east, suddenly the Ross's house is hidden behind a wooden box. I can't wait to see what happens when 701 goes up, which is twice the size of 611. With the current MOR, I think it's a good step forward. You have a 7-member commission you're going to create, and I think Todd is going to have a challenge to fill all those positions. It's extremely ambitious to get people of all those different persuasions and expertise together. They're willing to serve on a panel. This panel is going to be given a lot of responsibility. They're going to have to come up with the design review criteria, which I think are going to be the key to the whole success of this MOR. I'm a little concerned about still this idea of being able to build relatively small structures that have subgrade parking. I just don't see that working on Green Street. I would urge you to pass this ordinance and hope that you put together a good DRB that can address design review criteria and make this process go forward in a positive fashion.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Any questions? Next is Linda Lorenz, 409 West High on the MOR, and after Linda will be Lisa Truel.
I own property at 409, which, as I've told various groups of you, I bought so that I could ride my bike to work in 5 minutes, and because I wanted a house with wood floors and all of this. I've gone to these meetings and I've listened and I've read through all these things, and I guess I don't get it. I feel as though the street that I live on is going to be trashed by whatever happens on Green. I look at that beautiful Ross house and that horrid thing that's going in next to it and know that there's 2 more of them to come. I'm appalled at the parking lot on Green Street, all those parking lots that the Presbyterian Church has, and it looks to me like we have something in place and it isn't being enforced, or it doesn't work, or it isn't right. So I'm pleased that the review board is going to be changed, and I'm glad that we're looking at architectural things, but I still don't feel like my property in particular and the neighborhood which I really want to live in is being protected by any of this. I don't know enough about it to tell you what it should be, but I'm not comfortable with it.
Questions? Yes. Gentlemen?
Linda, I just had a question that actually I'm still up in the air about, and would be happy to hear from members of the public around this, which is whether or not you support partially submerged parking as an alternative to surface parking in the MOR district.
I don't know. I certainly can't stand those awful parking lots, even the ones we have now that are just hunks of gravel and 4 cars parked all over the people's backyards. I don't know if you can design something that will fit in with the rest of the neighborhood and be safe and be cost-effective in all the things that people talk about. I imagine that there will be nothing but a parking lot behind these things that are coming in, and there's nothing but parking behind what was the meeting house that I attended and the property next to it, although that house is not as bad looking as it might be. I honestly don't know. If it could fit all of our criteria and there'll be green grass in the back instead, I suppose I would like it, but I certainly don't want anything on stilts, and I don't want anything where it's hard to come out onto Green Street without running over a pedestrian or a bicyclist or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Next is Lisa Truel, 714 West Iowa. After Lisa will be Curtis Pettyjohn.
Good evening. I urge you to vote in favor of tonight's proposal because I think requiring design criteria is a step in the right direction. My vision for the MOR district centers around thoughtful redevelopment and preservation. By thoughtful, I mean a mix of existing apartment buildings, historic homes, newly constructed brownstones, smaller unit apartment buildings, and adaptive reuse of the remaining unique and interesting structures that give Green Street and Elm Street the character that they have. I would love to see small specialty shops, art studios, dance studios, music studios, and offices being offered financial help to reuse these buildings. Now for reality. I'm afraid that without such incentives, the only financially feasible thing to do with many of these old structures is to raise and rebuild student apartment buildings. With more and more student apartment buildings being constructed in other parts of the city, the question regarding is there really a need? For the first time in almost 10 years of living in the neighborhood, I am seeing vacancy signs for apartments directly across the street from campus. Before we allow the erosion of a neighborhood, we need to consider the unique characteristics of our situation. I understand that in general, urban planners think increased density would encourage development in the area, and this certainly is very logical, and I have seen it work in other cities. But I'm afraid that it will not work here unless the kind of residents we attract to the higher density housing has 12-month purchasing power versus the typical undergrad who is here for 8 to 9 months out of the year. At least when I was a student, my purchasing needs were very minimal. And I realize that times have changed, and I hope I am wrong. Because if I am not, we have allowed a district to erode into student filing cabinets on our watch. Some of the minor changes in tonight's proposal that I urge you to consider is please give a real voice to the resident member of the DRB by requiring a unanimous vote, and if you can't require that, at least a supermajority. Also, make the landowner be required to be a resident in the MOR, because right now, as it would stand, there would be more people with a pro-development stance and financial ties to the development community than to the residential neighborhood. And also requires strict design criteria for the partially submerged parking lots. Parking is something that we have to work with. It's a very complex issue. There is no easy answer. I am told that what I would like to see is underground parking is not financially feasible for this area, and that partially submerged parking, if it would come with design criteria, that it would be architecturally screened like the Europa House with an exit out the back, and not out onto Green Street like many of the residents said that would be a safety concern. That is something that could be worked out if the safety issues could be worked out. I think that the one thing that I worry about with the partially submerged parking is that we not have another New Yorker building on our hands where we have a mound of dirt with some grass on top of it, calling that it is screened. It's being screened using landscaping. I think you have to screen it with apartments to make it not visible from the street. I guess my rally cry here tonight is no more New Yorkers. Let's not build any more apartment buildings that crowd and tower over existing unique structures. Let's build parking that is truly hidden from view. Finally, let's keep the green in Green Street. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Next is Curtis Pettyjohn, 907 South Orchard, on the topic of the MOR. After Curtis will be Karen Coomer.
Hi, Curtis Pettyjohn, 907 South Orchard. Several months ago, I went with a friend who was looking to rent a house, and she was going with her kids to look at a house on Illinois Street, which at that time was a block down the 500 block of Illinois. And it's a house that I had had my eye on for the couple of years that I've been living here. It is the worst house on the street. And it's not a house that was owned by Russ Van Landingham. It is a house that, it turned out as I walked through the house with my friend, is owned by a man named Steve Cochran. Now, Mr. Cochran has another house like that at the corner of Green and, is it Kohler? Which he's doing the same thing. Oh, let me just tell you what our little conversation was like. I found out that he owned the office, which is a place that I love going to and love supporting, as I love supporting all Urbana businesses when I can. And he said to me, I'm getting out of that business. I'm getting into real estate. Well, standing in the house that he owned and looking at the horrible condition that that house is in was appalling. And it makes my skin crawl to think that that is where he's headed. And then I came to this meeting tonight and just heard from someone that he's being allowed to build a 4-story building on Green Street, and that the approval is going through. I don't understand why we reward people who trash our city. I don't understand it at all. Some people feel that preservationists don't want to let go of the past and want to have it stay the same. And I don't feel that that is true. I mean, how many European cities have people traveled to, seen old houses, and seen a vibrant modern city living in the midst of them? One of the things that concerns me, and I guess I'll speak to this, is that when I moved here, I grew up in Springfield, land of Lincoln, 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 Lincoln. But at least there was a sense of identity with the state capital. When I lived in Chicago, Chicago has a very varied and rich history. And there's a sense of who you are if you're a Chicagoan. When I moved to Champaign and to Urbana, it's hard to get an idea of what that means. I'm from Urbana. Nobody has a sense of history here. And it's not that we don't have history, it's that it's been ignored and that it's being torn down. And I'm not the first person to say that you can't move forward unless you understand the past. And you can't understand the past if you've destroyed it. So having these buildings torn down all along Green Street to be replaced with something that would look probably just fine next to a Chili's or a Chi-Chi's is not what is going to help us create a stronger identity. In fact, it blands. It's a blanding of America. And the last thing that I would like to say is that we are all responsible. This city council, every city council before this one, and every one of us as citizens is responsible for allowing people to own property and not maintain it to a standard that is acceptable. And that, in my eyes, is totally unacceptable. We have ordinances, and we should be enforcing them. And if they're not, then let's change them and let's make them stronger and enforce them. There is no reason why the buildings should be allowed to fall to pieces and then we're told, well, it's decrepit. Well, there is no excuse there. We have got to be stronger and tougher. Thank you.
Any questions? All right, thank you. Next is Karen Coomer, 1104 Devonshire, speaking on behalf of PACA, Preservation and Conservation Association, on the topic of the MOR.
Karen Coomer, 1104 Devonshire Drive, Champaign. I'm the Executive Director of the Preservation and Conservation Association. I was at about the same spot in the mid-1980s talking about this very same subject during a time when we were doing a downtown to campus survey of all the historic residential buildings in this West Urbana neighborhood. And while we were doing that survey, it came to light that there were plenty of wonderful neighborhoods, historic structures, and owners who cared about them. And they came to us at that, what can we do to protect these? And out of that came the Downtown to Campus plan, which, as people have mentioned, did involve a lot of rezoning of neighborhoods to the betterment of those neighborhoods. Main Street was rezoned, and everybody now, I think, is really excited about all the single-family homes that have been reconverted back and the wonderful work that's going on Main Street. Elm and Green Street were also targeted to be rezoned, but there was a lot of controversy over that. And Mayor Markland had a vision, and his vision at that time was to create a historic corridor from downtown to campus that would be an elegant entryway. We would have nice lawns, great setbacks, the large trees in the historic buildings would be preserved, and it would be a tie from the historic campus to the historic downtown. The MOR was created to help redevelop this as a mixed office residential area that would be part of his vision. We've had some limited successes over those years. Some small businesses and groups have converted houses to commercial uses. A lot of single-family homes have been restored, including the very historic and National Register listed Ricker House. The Brighton House is still being used as a single-family residence. And we've even had some good redevelopment. The Hunsinger apartment building in the 700 block, I think, is one example that's even carried over to Main Street and a good design infill there. A lot of historic houses that contribute to this neighborhood are still being preserved and are still being used, and they enhance the character and scale of this streetscape. Even some of the newer apartment buildings from the 1970s, such as the 700 and 800 block, blend in with their scale and with their submerged underground parking. I think the Preservation Association is encouraged by the use of the design guide to be involved in a revised MOR ordinance. But we would urge that the Historic Preservation Commission that you have appointed to help preserve the character of the city be actively involved in the creation of those design guidelines. I would say that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of design guidelines and examples out there already that could be used by this new commission. We also approve very much of the change to the review board to get more citizen involvement in the design review board. But you need to be very careful, as has been pointed out by other people tonight, about the selection of the membership of that committee so that they have the Wall Street and the city in their charge. However, little has been done to market the MOR to the public as a mixed office and residential area. It's only being promoted as a residential area, and as that, as a place to redevelop apartment buildings. The ordinance seems still to be weighted to deal with new construction. It talks about FAR, density, and design guidelines, but there's really nothing there to change, to encourage people to reuse their buildings and the existing properties that are there. I think incentives along that line would help. These could be very simple, such as code changes that would encourage the redevelopment of the existing historic properties, low-interest grants or loans that even would just work for exterior improvements, such as painting or re-roofing, that seem minor to a lot of people, but can be very costly for historic and large building. We need to market these for different uses, including single-family and small business use. You might consider property tax assessment freezes, such as the state has done to encourage the redevelopment of historic properties, or an abatement on taxes. These would be done for just a limited time until people can get some of their costs of their reinvestments back. If this can't be done in the zoning ordinance, then I would like a promise from the council tonight that these would be addressed concurrently with the development of design guidelines, so that the marketing of this area and the re-enhancement of the design guidelines could work along together. Thank you.
Any questions? All right, thank you. Next is Liz Cardman, 708 West California, on the MOR. After Liz will be Carolyn Baxley.
Thank you. I'm Liz Cardman, 708 West California, and I'm here tonight. I'd like to dispel two myths. And first, that it's only the immediately adjacent to the MOR who are concerned about what happens there. Of the original petition of nearly 200 signatures requesting a moratorium on development in the MOR, roughly 15% were people who don't live in West Urbana. And one person working one lunch hour at Strawberry Fields gathered most of these signatures. And I'm sure that with a concerted effort and more time, we could have gathered significantly more. The fact is that people throughout Urbana care about the heart of Urbana and the main corridor to their downtown. And with that in mind, I'd like to read from a column in the News Gazette, June 16, 2003. It's Phil Bloomer's column on the retirement of Vic Isaacson. And in this column, he quotes our Superintendent Amberg, who says, quote unquote, "If we eat the possibility of replacing Leal, the board president would have asked how long I wanted to be employed. It's not that I have anything against new buildings, but we've had success with renovations, and that's what this community values. And you need your support from the community to do these projects. They're the ones who vote. They voted to preserve this architecture. And Vic Isaacson has done that for us." I urge you to consider that. The second myth I'd like to dispel is that people who are interested in preserving the historic feel of Green and Elm Streets are rabidly anti-development in some way. I believe it's important to maintain the current feel and have any development be harmonious with the adjacent neighborhoods. Even a landlord who owns property throughout West Urbana, including one property within the MOR, has promoted the benefits of this area as it is. And in the student paper, the Daily Illini of last week, Weiner Properties advertised as follows: tree-lined streets, low density, free off-street parking, unique amenities. Further, I feel if the city staff and city council are interested in forging new directions for the MOR district, I really encourage you to be creative. Rather than risk the health of the neighborhood to the south with cheap development, why not consider adaptive reuse with the look and feel of Siva, Illinois, where historic properties have been converted to artist studios, galleries, gift shops, restaurants, and the like. I believe this kind of development will attract year-round locals and visitors. And more important, it will complement West Urbana and capitalize on the unique and existing strengths we have in downtown Urbana, whether it's Strawberry Fields, Art Mart, International Gallery, Mirabelle's, the Cinema Gallery, Priceless Books, Heel to Toe. I truly believe that if Urbana builds upon its proven strengths, Urbana will thrive. We have a lot to be proud of in our town, and I say let's encourage more. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Okay, thank you. Next, Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main in Urbana, on the topic of the MOR. After Carolyn will be Georgia Morgan.
Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main in Urbana. I was on the Plan Commission when the MOR language was drafted. We worked long and hard on the downtown to campus plan, and one of the things that I had pointed out, and I did send you a letter which I trust that all of you received. I sent it by email, so if you haven't checked your email, there it is. One of the things that I think was particularly significant about the MOR district is that there was absolute 100% unanimous agreement on the Plan Commission of how this area should develop. This was extremely rare in my experience. I spent 8 years on Plan Commission, and we were almost never in 100% agreement on anything, and I'm sure that you've experienced the same thing on council. I thought that was enough to virtually ensure that this district would endure and survive, various attempts to change it. I've heard since then from both staff and members of council that it's quote-unquote not working. Before you throw in the towel on this district, I would really like to see the city put forth some effort to market this area to new businesses. I don't think that most businesses coming into Urbana have that these two streets are available for business development. There are a lot of small entrepreneurs that are looking. They talk to Norman and me practically weekly about our downtown spaces, all of which are rented. There are 2 first-floor spaces available for rent in downtown, but the rents on those 2 are above market, and I maintain that that's primarily why they're empty, because if it's in market, it's taken. This type of thing can be extended down Green and Elm, just as the Plan Commission and Council at the time projected, but you have to do something. You can't just wait for people to come to you. And what I would really like to see out of this whole analysis of the MOR district is a real effort to try to promote this area as available for business development. Do a brochure, send it out there somehow instead of just putting it in the zoning books and waiting for people to find it. So that's primarily the message that I wanted to bring you, and my letter goes into a little bit more detail. I, like Mrs. Truill and Ms. Cardman and Ms. Coomer, I would like to see some real incentives developed here. It certainly is deserving of those and offers great potential for extending our business down to the campus. One other thing that's come up that I think really should be addressed as the council looks at this issue is positioning Urbana for the installation of light rail. I am very much in favor of light rail in Urbana. I think it's a wonderful thing. I've traveled to many European cities that have it, and it's great places. It connects people. But I do not think that light rail and adaptive reuse of existing structures along Green and Elm are mutually exclusive. You don't have to have high-density residential development along a light rail route. You can also have small businesses that people in other areas want to ride the rail to enjoy. So I urge you to make the DRB changes just the first step. One of the main intents of this district was to halt high-density development. There was much discussion at the time about the fact that it was crossing over Lincoln Avenue. One of the main intents of it was to halt it in its tracks, and now here it comes again, straight eastward on Green, and you really need to think long and hard before you let that continue down Green Street, because we're missing an opportunity here for some small business development that could really help our tax base and help the citizens and keep the density down that's going to High Street residents. Thank you.
Carolyn, would you answer a couple questions, Ms. Pat?
Thank
Oh,
you.
sorry, I didn't see your hand.
I think I know the answer, but I just want clarification. When you talk about incentives for business uses on Green and Elm, are you talking about exclusively for adaptive reuse related businesses, or do you think the city should give incentives for any business use? For example, the new construction where the first floor is commercial and the floors above are residential.
Well, certainly the intent of the district and, the way it was drafted was to make every attempt to use existing structures that had high integrity and were available, for that. I mean, admittedly, there are probably some structures, as we've heard, that have been let go to the point that may or may not be feasible, in which case, some infill development such as Kevin Hunsinger has done on Green Street with retail on the first floor and perhaps apartments above, would work. The problem is, high-density residential that's not compatible with the existing, buildings around it. I don't think any of us expect to see every structure retained on Green Street. That wasn't the intent originally, and I don't think it, has changed. We all knew at the time have to come out to, make way for some small parking lots. There have to be some parking lots somewhere to serve, businesses. If there's not a space on site, then you have to develop one within, walking distance of a new business or it won't survive. But there are many lots along there that would provide for small, 3 or 4 car areas, and most small businesses like Cinema Gallery, for example, on Main Street, I mean, we would think we had died and gone to heaven if we had more than 5 people in there at once. So, it would be great, for small businesses who really don't need a lot of parking, and it would have fun residential. So that's the type of thing that we all hoped at the time would develop along there. Very small, but, extremely interesting and, compatible businesses.
Thank you.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Carolyn, as I guess a former business owner on Green Street, have you seen any initiatives since 1990 to market Green Street? Do you know how the businesses that are currently there got there, and was there any kind of marketing initiative that you know of?
I'm not aware of any. I bought Lindley House, and subsequently turned it into a bed and breakfast strictly as a preservation effort. I was on the preservation board at the time. It was being advertised as a teardown for high-density development. So I bought it as a stopgap and wound up turning it into a business, but that was just, sort of by accident. Timothy John, who located next door, I think just took advantage of the opportunity to purchase an already existing commercial building, which was in very good condition for the salon. And Curtis Pettyjohn could probably speak more directly to that since he's been associated with Timothy John. But I think it's not as a result of any type of marketing effort that those certainly wasn't in our case. But that's what's going to be needed if you want some business to march down Green toward campus. You have to let people know it's available, because there are people out there looking to locate, because, as I said, we get calls from them. Someone referred to artist studios. Now, that's not technically a commercial use, since a lot of artists don't open their studios, but we probably get 2-3 calls a month for downtown spaces for artist studios. There are a tremendous number of artists living and working in Champaign-Urbana. So if you had an artist studio that would open it one day a week to the public, that would be terrific. Low-impact business and good for the neighborhood. But that's just one example. I mean, there are other types who occasionally approach us about property, and, you know, as close as the campus is, you know, I still believe in this concept. I still think that it's possible, but it's going to have a kick in, you know, to get it into gear here. It's got to have something to push it forward instead of just sitting there on the books.
Just a follow-up question, do you have a particular opinion on submerged parking, given the proximity of your business, former business?
Well, I think
to
it's
the
great
Urbana?
anytime you can hide the parking. I do know it's incredibly expensive, so I'm not a real expert on that subject. And I know that a lot of developers do not want to go to the expense to excavate and put it in. But, you know, I think there are other potential, you know, things. I mean, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that's more familiar with the language that I helped draft, but I think the parking has to be within 500 feet. Is that correct?
650.
650, okay. So there might be some potential for, you know, that's pretty good distance, so there might be some potential for areas with proper screening. I mean, you can do a small aesthetic-looking parking lot if you really set your mind to it, so, you know, they have to exist somewhere. Underground would be great.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Next is Georgia Morgan, 804 West Nevada.
Georgia Morgan. I don't have a lot to add to the cogent remarks that have already been made by Lisa Trull and Karen Coomer and Liz Cardman and just now Carolyn Baxley. I feel very strongly that the historic buildings that we have in this district on Green Street and Elm Street and Main Street are treasures of Urbana that need to be protected, and of course, they're not protected if they're torn down, and they're not protected if they're crowded out by new buildings with big footprints that hide them. So I think that should be noted. If you're going to ask me about submerged parking, I'll tell you that I think that partially submerged parking from the street is an abomination. You have only to look at the building at the corner of Lincoln and Iowa to see one of the most hideous buildings in Urbana, House on Stilts. The one on Lincoln and Nevada is better only in that you can't see the parking from both streets. You can only see it from one street. Hidden parking should be hidden. It should be hidden from the people that drive down the street, and hopefully it should not be an eyesore to the neighbors.
Questions? Thank you very much. Next we have Matt Taylor of 612 West Green. He does not wish to speak, or do you want to speak? Okay. All right.
I just wanted to, Matt Taylor again from 612 West Green. My wife and I bought the Raker house a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons why we bought the house was because of the neighborhood and because of the intentions, said and unsaid, of maintaining this area and its historic nature. I just wanted to support the current MOR proposal. I think that some of the things that have been said here I do agree with. So I just wanted to come and voice my support and to say that my wife and I are here for the long term, and we really want this thing to work and to I guess the biggest thing for me has been to live in a place where you know your neighbors and you're really proud of your property in the area, and to know that the structure across the street from me, and to know that the structure that's being proposed and that was approved for 701 are going up, really it affects homeowners around the area. and I think it affects, it will affect future homeowners that may or may not locate there because of those types of structures. So I think that's when those types of things are approved, that's one of the things you have to really think about, is how it affects when those large structures go in with such a massive footprint. It really creates, it really kind of diminishes that whole, historic preservation and historic feel that you see in a lot of neighborhoods. And I really agree with a lot of the, what has been said before and what has also been proposed tonight. The incentives are great. Let's rehabilitate existing structures. And I guess Pat had asked a question earlier about proposing new commercial. I wouldn't be opposed to that either. I guess it just depends. If the existing structure is to a point where it's not feasible, and if there's also safety concerns. But again, like the gentleman said earlier, there's something that's wrong if we let the current structures become to such a state that they are a safety hazard. I think that the ordinances should be enforced again. So I wasn't going to speak, but I decided to speak, so that's what I wanted to say. And any questions?
Questions for Mr. Taylor? All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Next is Brian Adams, 412 West Elm.
Area, I think, will also be a help, avoid more big boxes. A comment that several people have said, providing incentives. Another paper, I think it was yesterday's paper, downtown. They're talking about downtown Champaign, of course. So they don't know what to do with all the money they're getting from their tax incentive. I apologize for what that stands for. Tax
financing.
Thank you. Tax increment financing. There's something we could do in the MOR district. That sort of district would give a financial carrot to matching some of the money that they put into of a home for business or match some of that money and increase and rehabilitation. My last point is that when I think of my summer, I went to California, and I think of some nice places when I think of Auburn, California, or Full Mountain View, California, or Santa. I think of wonderful downtowns, old picturesque houses, and I'm towards that direction here in Urbana. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for you. I think not a really clear answer to this, and I think there's a lot involved, and can put pressure in different ways. And, the cities want, the church is another pressure point. And a property owner in the area, you've been extremely vocal. You've been very much an advocate for Green Street Church. On Green Street, my question to you is, are you your church as passionately as you're speaking to and the Plan Commission about their plan to demolish properties on Green Street in Elm?
I haven't had that opportunity. I just learned of it. So, and I think the reason that they schedule was because, but it hasn't been long, so I haven't had any. The one meeting I was aware of, I couldn't attend, commission meeting that same night. So opportunities.
Well, I've urged and I've offered to be a council representative where we would speak to, talk about trying to get the church long-term plan that is shared with the neighbors, start doing some planning and looking at alternatives, parking needs. Maybe the city could be a help because we own one that's not far from where the church is, but really that don't involve demolishing houses. And I'll just offer again to you and to wound me up on it to have a meeting with the church.
All right, thank you. There are long-range plans about a week ago.
Okay.
So I can certainly.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Any other communications from audience members? From council members? Seeing none, we'll go right to reports of standing committees. Since there's no old business, Ms. Chenoweth, are you the current chair?
I believe so. Okay, we're looking at, from the Committee of the Whole, ordinance number 2003-10-1 2023-119, that refers to an ordinance approving a second amendment to a certain Urbana Home Consortium Community Housing Development Organization agreement with Homestead Corporation. This is the Eads of Lincoln Development fiscal year 2002-2003. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Huth?
Yes.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
Next, we have resolution number 2003-10-023R. That refers to a resolution endorsing the Urbana-Champaign Continuum of Care 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness. So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Huth?
Yes.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Mr. Chenoweth?
Next, we have ordinance number 2003-10-116. That refers to an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement for use of the right-of-way. This refers to 410 North Vine Street. So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Being no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Huth?
Yes.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 6 ayes. Ms. Chenoweth?
The next committee of the whole meeting will be next week, Monday, November 10th, 7:30, same place, same time.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have reports of special committees. Any special committee reports? Okay, reports of officers. Just wanted to report that myself and some of the staff members are still working on the Illinois Power purchase by Exelon, trying to make sense of that as it changes nearly day by day. And while the legislation is kind of a moving target, we've identified one constant in all of the proposals by Exelon, and that is the request for a rate increase for the years 2007 to 2010. And that seems, in my opinion, I haven't heard any good reason why Illinois Power and I guess Exelon would be asking for rate increases at this time. A lot of the information that we're seeing about the details of the purchase agreement, I guess, which was made final, or it was, I guess, made final today by a vote of the two boards of Dynegy and Exelon. But some of the financial analysis of it indicates that Exelon will be forgiving $2.3 billion of debt that Dynegy owes to Illinois Power for the sale of its power generation in the state of Illinois. And so we've been asking questions about what does that mean. It looks like Dynegy is merely receiving these power plants without having to pay for them. It would be a windfall, and that ComEd and Exelon would then be getting rate increases for the purposes, express purposes of saving Illinois Power. So we're trying to get to the bottom of it as far as what some of the requests from Exelon means. But I, for one, have yet to be convinced that the sale of Illinois Power would require a rate increase in those years, which would generate some $2.5 billion to Exelon over that period of time. So I've been asking our legislators to oppose this legislation as long as it includes that rate increase request. If Illinois Power and Exelon want to have an expedited hearing about the merger, but still a full process, not a stripped-down process, then I think that's something that could probably happen. But this rate increase seems to me to be an unnecessary raising of rates at a time well in the future when we couldn't possibly have all the information that that's the right thing to do. Oh, Steve or Bruce, do you have anything to add to that?
Todd, do you have the figures? Mayor, do you have the figures in front of you about how those rate increases would affect, for instance, the city of Urbana and its residents?
Right. Well, we did a little bit of analysis just based on some of the estimates. A 9% increase in rates, the estimated would be an average of $65 per year per household. When you calculate that and multiply that by the number of households in Urbana, which is between 14 and 15,000 households, you get about $950,000. So it's nearly $1 million issue to the residents of Urbana on an annual basis. For Champaign, since it's bigger, about $1.75 million per year. So this is a $1 million decision for us, well, I don't know how much say we'll have in the decision, but it's $1 million issue to us since the homeowners alone will be paying nearly $1 million more just in the city of Urbana alone. Gentlemen?
Mayor, is your office discussing partnering with the city of Champaign and exploring options for municipalizing our utilities, given that the Champaign City Council has been moving forward on hiring consultants to help them with that process?
Yes, we plan on bringing something to the committee meeting next week. Champaign Legal is taking the lead on drafting the agreement. We heard today that they expect to have something for us to look at in the next couple of days, and we hope that something's ready to bring to the committee. The concept would be that we would share costs with Champaign and the university on a third basis to look at options that we have as far as municipalization of the system and other options that we might have. So again, we'll hope to have that on the agenda for next week.
Okay.
Mr. Walton.
Ready to switch topics?
Sure enough. Okay. Go ahead.
I just wanted to distribute the monthly economic development report on some of the projects that are going on in Urbana, and also note for council to provide some marketing materials that we've recently produced that include a significant amount of information regarding Urbana sites and Urbana demographics, and you can use these in yourself, as I know sometimes we don't receive all of the leads that sometimes folks want to contact their council members, and so we would be able to provide these to you if you need additional copies of them. If you have any questions on the activities last month, please give me a call.
Any questions, Ms. Chenoweth?
Are these are excellent, by the way, really excellent, and I wondered if they would be available on our website.
Yes, we have all the information that you have here, plus the commercial industrial listings are on our under economic development. In addition to that, we have most of the listings by realtors, including pictures of the sites, demographic information, utility information, access information, and the like, in order to make an investment decision. So the websites come along very well.
Good.
No, can't answer your question.
Okay. Any questions? All right. Well, we're ready to get on to new business then. First is an ordinance approving a major variance, increase the institutional sign area to 36.09 square feet in the city's R4 medium-density multiple family zoning district at 2004 South Philo Road. This was case number ZBA-03-MAJ-08. Ms. Bell?
Thank you. This is a request from Grace United Methodist Church for some new institutional signage, 36 square foot sign on their property. Currently, they have about 50 square feet in total for message display institutional signage on their property. That's with two signs of both approximately 25 square feet in area. The proposed signage is really part of some church improvement plans that they have for the property. They plan on placing this new modern sign about 42 feet from the curb of Philo Road. I just wanted to mention that the church is in the R4 district, and there are no minimum setbacks for institutional signage. for their property. The variance review criteria is outlined in the staff memorandum, and I'd also like to mention that at the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting, the church was granted a minor variance for height from 6 feet to 7.5 feet for this new proposed sign. The City Council may grant the variance as requested. You may grant the variance subject to certain terms and deny the variance request. Again, the Zoning Board of Appeals did vote 4-0 to forward this variance request to you with a recommendation for approval. The increased area of an institutional sign from 20 square feet to 36 square feet with the condition that all signs on the property be removed and that the new sign conform to the general specifications as submitted. Staff concurs with the findings of the Zoning Board of Appeals, and we hope that you grant the variance with the conditions set forth by the Zoning Board.
Okay, any questions? Questions? Motion will be in order.
Second.
The motion is second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Booth?
Yes.
Ms. Parrott?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. Next is an ordinance amending the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, amendments pertaining to the mixed office residential zone. This was plan case number 1865-T-03. Tyler?
This has been a joint project with Mr. Kowalski and myself, so split the workload on this, and need to apologize as well for very lengthy staff report of 17 pages. I know everybody's read it carefully and heard all the good comments, as well as contained within the minutes. I'm going to go ahead and skip through most of the first part of the memorandum, which provides some introduction, background on the history of the MOR district, a summary of projects that have been proposed and built in the MOR district, both new and reuse, and attached to the memorandum some very helpful background in a slideshow PowerPoint presentation that we made to Plan Commission. You'll also all remember the interim development ordinance, which is still underway until November 21st, and the purposes of that IDO. There's a summary of the previous efforts at amendment back starting in 1997, and many of those previous recommendations are carried forward in the current ordinance. And then a summary of different approaches that we've taken in the current amendment review process with the Plan Commission and Historic Preservation Commission and various stakeholder meetings. So just a summary of the proposed amendment, which is contained in the attached ordinance, is first a clarification of the purpose of the MOR district, and just to touch on both the desire for adaptive reuse in MOR as well as the conditions under which new construction may be allowed. We've done some clarification of additional use regulations in the MOR district, and made is the new section 5-8B, which would allow for administrative review of adaptive reuse projects. And the idea here was a lot of discussion by Plan Commission on ways that the city could encourage use of existing structures in the MOR, and a lot of discussion about incentive programs. And one thing that we can do just working with the zoning ordinance is look for streamlining and ways to facilitate the types of projects that do include adaptive reuse. And a good way to do this, we found, is to allow for administrative review, removes some of the perceptual barriers of having to attend public meetings, and this was also something that was suggested in the earlier effort to amend the MOR district. Also, Section 5-8.f would allow flexibility in existing codes and requirements for adaptive reuse, and that's something that's currently contained in the MOR ordinance, but would now apply for the administrative review as well. And that's the flexibility that's been discussed tonight as well. For example, parking flexibility in a non-residential situation, and other variances within a minor variance range for development. So we feel that this is one to help encourage that adaptive reuse. Location of parking facilities, this has been discussed tonight as well, and the idea here is to allow for hidden parking that's partially submerged. Why partial? Well, completely submerged parking, fully underground parking is really something that can only be done for very high density structure. Economics are such that that licensed architect, an owner of property within the district, a citizen residing within the district or within 250 feet of the district, a local developer, and an owner of a local business. Next, we've provided some guidelines for decisions, and this was done in consultation with legal staff. Decisions for quorum, voting, and abstention for the Development Review Board. Just a brief summary that every member of the Review Board present at a meeting must vote either aye or nay unless they abstain, and that shall only be for reasons of an asserted conflict of interest. Abstention shall not change the count of the board members present for the purpose of determining a quorum, which would be 4 from 7 members. Majority shall be calculated on the basis of those members present and voting, that is not abstaining, but in no case shall be fewer than 3. So we're looking for positive affirmation from the board, and certainly would not want to see approvals by 2 members in the case of just a quorum. Application and site plan submittal requirements are revised, made more specific for what would be needed, particularly with design review. Procedures also improved. We've made more realistic timeframes. We've increased the public notice to within 250 feet, as with other zoning cases. Currently, it says 100 feet, and we felt that wasn't sufficient, and retained the ability to appeal cases to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Development plan review criteria have been simplified and modified, and now focus on compatibility with the surrounding neighborhood, parking and access, screening and landscaping, site details and design guidelines. And then finally, the design guidelines, we have a placeholder that these must be considered by the Development Review Board. And currently in the MOR district, the board is specifically prohibited from looking at architectural design, and that it's very difficult when you're trying to look for projects that fit into the character of the neighborhood. Very difficult to do without looking at design, and that was one thing we struggled with as a staff board. We've already begun with the Historic Preservation Commission and with a graduate student working with a new group called Civitas in downtown Urbana out of the University of Illinois to define what those guidelines might be. The reason we don't have them in final form is that they really need to be illustrated, and that takes time, but we're hoping to come back at the beginning of next year with what you might call a pattern book, which looks at these different design guidelines and illustrates them so they're easy to understand and apply. And we should emphasize the operative word of guidelines, that we want to retain flexibility and creativity in design, and so perhaps there'd be a menu of items that will be encouraged, and perhaps a smaller list of items that would be discouraged. So we've identified some already that have been mentioned in our discussions with the Historic Preservation Commission and to some extent with the Plan Commission. This memorandum also includes a number of issues that were discussed but are not incorporated in the ordinance, either outside the purview of the zoning ordinance or aren't proposed for other reasons. These include demolition procedures, and suggestion was made there should be limitations on these, and this is something that we don't recommend because we do see it as a basic property right that can be protected in the cases of historic landmarks and districts, and feel that that would be the appropriate method. Should note that 87% of the properties in the MOR zone are not owner occupied, so they represent investments that people have made, and we feel it would be seen as a property rights taking to impose demolition restrictions in this zone, different from the rest of the community. And the Plan Commission agreed with that, and that one of the members suggested a modification that did not receive support from the remaining plan commissioners. Encouraging adaptive reuse, we talked about the ways to do that by allowing for administrative review and allowing for flexibility in code requirements, and those are presented in the ordinance. But there's a lot of discussion about financial incentive programs and some of those different methods, as well as marketing of the MOR district. And example might be the packets handed out tonight. There could, for example, be an added commercial property district in MOR, and we could add properties there as well as to the website listing. So that's, that's something that can certainly be done to just let people know that this is a district that's available for a mix of office and residential, in particular adaptive reuse. We discussed changing the table of uses. We took a hard look at the commercial uses and whether they were consistent with the residential uses in the area and adjacent. And we really felt that with the Development Review Board review and the design guidelines that those uses were appropriate. And so we didn't recommend any changes. We just noted there's just a handful of uses that are allowed only with a conditional use or special use. And, that's to have these developments go to zoning board or plan commission, as well as a public development review board, might be a little burdensome. So we've identified some of those. Those could perhaps at some future time be allowed as permitted uses, but that's not proposed currently. Long discussion and a lot of background, a lot of differing viewpoints on the development regulations. If you look in the PowerPoint presentation, it shows you some good illustrations of those limits on the FAR, which is 0.7 currently, but can only be applied to up to 8,500 square feet of site area. So really limits lot consolidation. Testimony, and we have had on staff quite a few discussions with architects and landowners that this is too prohibitive and limits creative design, quality design. We've had some specific requests for increases to the FAR or reductions in that lot consolidation limit. And there was some of this discussion as well at the Plan Commission, and some very helpful testimony from Barry Weiner at the Plan Commission meeting on October 23rd. And some interest from a few plan commissioners on looking at allowing for increased assembly of lots once the design guidelines are in place, and there can be a guarantee that these would be tasteful developments that would fit in with the neighborhoods. We also heard quite a bit of testimony on reductions in density in the MOR district, and really seeking to bring this back down to single-family densities. However, we do not recommend that due to the trade-offs in zoning rights that occurred at the time of the downtown to campus plan. We feel that this would prompt takings legal action against the city, so we did not recommend that. And there was one commissioner who suggested a reduction in the FAR, but that did not find support by the other commissioners. So in summary, given the differing views, we've stepped aside from the density issue for this current ordinance and are looking more specifically at procedures, composition of the Development Review Board, and the Design Review Guidelines, as well as just trying to improve the process. Other related actions that could be considered by the city that would be outside of this current case would be, potentially along the eastern edge might fit more within the downtown zoning designation. There is a suggestion to adjust the permit parking area so that the south side of Green Street properties along there would not be able to obtain a permit and thereby prevent folks living in apartments there, for example, from parking along High Street and trying to limit the impact of those apartment projects from nearby single-family residential areas. One of the proposals in the last year had some studies that could have been used as bedrooms, and this raised us the issue of our definition of bedroom, and the zoning ordinances really does not pin down the possibility for conversions, and would result potentially in not enough parking being provided. So that's something that we can, in a zoning ordinance, tighten up the definition of bedroom. If some space like a study could be converted to a bedroom, then that would have to require parking as well. Some modification to Historic Preservation Commission review of proposals around historic properties. Currently says contiguous and the zoning ordinance, and this could be a matter of practice and interpretation that contiguity directly across the street or directly adjacent, but could be with anywhere around the perimeter, and that's something that's a good suggestion, and we can begin to do that. That came up because we only brought the 611 Green Street project to Historic Preservation Commission because it's directly across from the Ricker House, whereas the other two proposals on Green Street were catty corner, and we can take that more liberal interpretation, and then at such time that we do clean up on our zoning ordinance, we'll clarify that as well. Another larger zoning issue is the whole question of, are we requiring enough parking for multifamily residences? There's a lot of changes, car ownership, and particularly with student car ownership, and we've shown some documented demand that car ownership's increasing. So the increased parking would be closer to the documented demand and could reduce impact on surrounding streets and properties. On the other hand, and these are big counterpoints, increasing parking's an effective downzoning of properties, and so we would want to look at some changes if we could. And also, you'd lose that incentive to keep car ownership and use down to encourage transit use, particularly in this part of the city. And again, requiring more parking just results in increased paved areas for parking. So this was something that we did not incorporate here for the MOR district. And there was a suggestion by one plan commissioner, but that was not supported by others. And then there's also been suggestions, well, if you're going to have parking, it needs to be completely underground. But as I mentioned previously, that's really not financially feasible in a medium-density district such as this one. So the findings are that this amendment would help in administering and enforcing the zoning ordinance. It's consistent with the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan and downtown to campus plan because it encourages the adaptive reuse of structures in the MOR zone, and also because it requires new development to be compatible with the district as a whole. It would allow for more citizen and stakeholder participation in the Development Review Board process. It would help to encourage compatible design in the MOR zone through the use of design guidelines and appropriate review criteria. It would improve the review procedures of the Development Review Board, and would help to streamline review of adaptive reuse projects by allowing for administrative approval. Your options, as always, would be to approve the attached ordinance as presented, approve it with specific changes, or deny it. Their last meeting, the Plan Commission voted 5-1 to recommend approval of the proposed text amendment based on the findings I just summarized. Staff concurs with that recommendation, and I'll note that Plan Commissioner Lou Hopkins is here this evening as well to help with answering any questions, and he was very active in making helpful suggestions as we work through the amendment with the Plan Commission. I do have a correction on the ordinance. It's one of these numbering items that Word does so well for you. On page 3, at the bottom in italics, it says adjustments to existing codes and regulations for adaptive reuse projects. That should have the letter D in front of it. The bottom for number 1, that line, adjustments to existing codes and regulations for adaptive reuse projects, should have a D. And we've attached the ordinance, a map showing the properties, the PowerPoint presentation, the existing version of the ordinance, and minutes from the different meetings that were held to discuss this. So with that, I'll end and hope to answer any questions.
Okay, questions, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion tonight about design guidelines, but if I understand correctly, they are not part of the ordinance that we would be passing.
They're referenced in the ordinance. So the Development Review Board's empowered to look at design, where currently they're not. So we've taken that step in that direction. That's one of the criteria. and we have a placeholder, I think it's the last section.
Section J.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're
Okay.
poised to incorporate them.
And approximately when might we see the proposal for the text of Section J?
We would expect that ready for review at the beginning of the year.
January? you think?
January.
So I'm just wondering what the Development Review Board is supposed to use in the way of design guidelines if they have to meet before we have them.
Well, as Libby mentioned, the important part is that they have the ability under number 5, right before the design guidelines section, to consider architectural appearance, mass and color, building materials, or architectural details. Although there wouldn't be the guidelines there to help guide them. But in the ordinance as it's currently written, they are specifically prohibited from looking at those factors. So our analysis that they'd be able to consider those things, although it wouldn't have the guidance, and that would be still quite a change from what's currently allowed. And we struggled with that a lot as a hopefully former member of the Development Review Board. I know we had a hard time talking with and not being able to discuss exactly the materials or massing, et cetera.
I think that that's a good and important improvement, but I would encourage, the whole reason that we passed the ordinance creating the moratorium was for the purpose of developing these design criteria, and so it's somewhat disappointing that here we are at the end of the moratorium, and that's the one thing that's missing. But I'm concerned about the Development Review Board coming under fire for any decision that they would make about design criteria when there are no design criteria. So I hope that, I don't know what's in the hopper. You folks probably have a better idea than I if someone's planning on springing something on us as soon as the moratorium is over. But I hope there's not a lot of time between November 20th and when this council has an opportunity to approve design criteria, because it puts whoever's on that board in, it puts the city in a precarious position.
Let's follow up on that if you don't mind for a second, Ms. Pat. Can you tell us exactly what the process would be? What would those guidelines go through the DRB? Or would they go to final council approval? Do you know what the recommended process is going to be for that?
Well, we anticipate that we'd have more, as was suggested tonight also, but more input from the Historic Preservation Commission as we come out with the first draft of those guidelines. And since they are a placeholder in the ordinance, we would expect that they would be adopted, reviewed by the Plan Commission, and adopted by City Council, although I don't think we envision that they would be spelled out or illustrated in the zoning ordinance, but would rather be kind of a separate document that would be adopted, though, and be part of the zoning ordinance.
So it would be mentioned by reference in the zoning ordinance and then be a standalone guideline pamphlet or something of that nature?
Right.
And so you're imagining that the guidelines would be drawn up with the guidance of the Historic Preservation Commission, and those recommendations would go to Plan Commission, and finally would come to Council for final approval.
Right.
And that's going to happen by January?
Well, I think what he's saying is that the guidelines will start that process in January. I don't know if that necessarily would
I think that's
end.
accurate. And we have a pretty good start on with a student from the Civitas group, and again, our intent is to have them to be very general and in a pattern book style, very illustrative, very wordy, like parts of our historic preservation ordinance, and they won't get into the kinds of details that our historic preservation ordinance gets into with, air conditioners and when you have to go to what review and all that. One of the approaches we've been taking is we've already done a survey of the existing architecture in the area on the corridor, not just the MOR, but in the Green and Elm Street corridor, and trying to highlight some of the most common features and use those in the pattern book. So it's not an easy process, and we're trying to keep it general and very understandable.
Thank you.
I agree with you, Ms. Pat, that it is too bad that we don't have those to consider tonight, but that's one of the downsides of a 120-day moratorium when we expect, the full process for all the other changes. And, unfortunately, this just takes a little bit longer, but I know that staff will bring that back as soon as humanly possible. Are you done, Ms. Pat? Did you have any more
Yes,
questions?
thank you.
Ms. Wyman and...
I have following up on Ms. Pat's question, with regard to the design guidelines. Are some of those, would some of those that will be suggested to the new design, the new DRB, would those be the suggested key elements illustrated in the October 1 Historic Preservation Commission discussion, where you mentioned suggested key elements, asymmetry, front porches, narrow facades faces the street, major entrances on the street side, those sorts of things? Is that what you imagine will be suggested and perhaps adopted?
And we summarize those on page 10 and 11.
Okay.
It's the same list, essentially.
I have a question regarding, on page 6 of the ordinance, where it talks about memberships under C. And it talks about, in number 3, I guess, moving on to page 7, number 3 talks about the 3-year terms. And I'm wondering if those are going to be staggered or not? Or
It's
if...
usual to stagger them, so if they're 3-year terms, you might expect, two in each of 2 different years, and then 3 in the 3rd year.
Okay. And so if someone has to give up their seat because they no longer have time or that sort of thing, then the replacement would not be for a 3-year, but just to finish that term. Okay.
So we keep the stagger the same.
Okay. Going to the bottom of page 7, under meetings, number 1, I'm happy to see that the meetings are going to be held in the evening, because I think that was a little bit of a sore spot or concern for some of the members of the community who wanted to come to the meetings this summer. But the last sentence, meetings may also be held at any time upon the call of the chair. And somehow I was recalling that that normally it's has to be the chair and one other member, or is that, I was just, seemed like, and if there's any sort of notice requirement, or if that's understood that it has to be a 24-hour notice requirement, that sort of thing.
I'm not sure entirely, but I know we took this language, I believe, from the Historic Preservation Commission ordinance, which, with the goal of making this act more like a commission, and that may be in the Historic Preservation Commission ordinance, because they can meet and discuss other activities and purposes other than just, determining a district or a landmark, so.
No, that sounds fine. I mean, following, I think, what the Historic Preservation Commission does, I think makes sense to just keep the same idea going, so people don't get confused. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Ms. Chenoweth?
I keep it short, but I have a number of questions. Is there any reason why in the design criteria on page 10 that's listed, why there's nothing about, specifically about landscaping or screening, submerged parking? It says underground parking or subgrade parking. Well, is there plans to kind of further refine that language to talk about design criteria for screening of submerged parking?
Yes, there will be. This is just summarized from Historic Preservation Commission. We didn't get into that level of detail, but I think under the section about parking, we talk about needing to develop guidelines specific to that, placement, landscaping, screening, what that will entail, and that would have to be part of the pattern book as well. So this is just a skeleton outline.
Okay. And yeah, and the safety issue as well. I know it's not design criteria exactly, but it's something that I think we need to be looking at with people backing up onto something as busy like Green Street. I can imagine it creating some real safety problems to come up onto Green Street. The second question I have is you say on page 16 that there's no agreement on the issue of marketing the MOR for business uses, and it's one of the things that you're not going to pursue at this point. I believe, because there was not kind of clear agreement. Well, you actually say you just find that here are a number of issues, but we did not find agreement, and it's not under the issues that will be pursued. So I'm wondering whether or not there's a plan to pursue aggressive marketing of the MOR for office and small business uses, and if not, what are the arguments that people have been making that make you reluctant to pursue that?
This section on other issues were just other issues discussed by the Plan Commission, not by necessarily by staff initiation or council. These were just other things that came up at the Plan Commission meeting, but which didn't find agreement, and for the most part were considered just outside the purview of the zoning ordinance. So it doesn't mean they're bad ideas or they can't be pursued further. This is just letting you know that there was discussion about these items, but they did not make it into the ordinance for one reason or another.
Okay. Would it take council action to make that happen? Again, it's not, you're right, it's not really in the purview of what we're talking about tonight, but I'm wondering how council would be able to take action if a majority of us felt as though we wanted to
I think on
to include that in our marketing strategy for commercial areas.
I think that's a good idea, and it's probably doesn't even need direction to staff, to pursue that. We're trying to market all of our commercial areas you see this evening, so to the extent that we can find spaces for different businesses, that certainly meets with our economic development goals, and it can be formalized or not. The appearance through additional plantings, it's kind of in the realm of streetscaping and arbor division, and it's operational. It's something that I think we have an interest in a lot of streets. Same with the traffic improvements. It comes up every year with the CIP. I know parts of Green Street have benefited from streetscape. So I guess the first three bullets would be maybe part of business as usual, hopefully could be incorporated. And then the last one was really a suggestion by one one Plan Commission member that the DRB recommendations go to City Council. And that was something that didn't get support from the other Plan Commission, but we wanted to be fair and just include all the issues that came up, or as many as we felt came up. So.
Okay. Do you know if our code, our ordinances has any kind of definition of small business? We use the word local business when we talk about the constitution of the review board, and I don't know if we actually have local business. I'm also wondering if anywhere there's precedent to understand what a small business means.
Some of the zoning uses break down into square footages in the zoning ordinance, but we don't really address form of ownership. Can you?
No, yeah, I think there's two uses, greenhouse and bakery, that for some reason are described. If you can have one under 2,500 square feet and one greater than 2,500 square feet, and they're allowed differently in different districts, but no specific definition of what a small business is, or and those are really the only two examples of where square footage is really called into play.
Okay. So when we say local business, talking about the Constitution of the Development Review, certainly that's something I support. I mean, we could have somebody who owns McDonald's or whatnot, sitting on the board, but what do we understand by that? Is that Champaign County or what?
I think we're hoping Urbana, best would be in the MOR district, but there are so few businesses, we weren't sure that Todd would be able to recruit one of them to serve. So I think the expectation was it would be an Urbana business person interested and active, and that the mayor would be able to recruit that person and bring that to the city council.
Okay. I have another question that has to do with accessory parking. I know that currently the folks, I guess, anywhere in Urbana can demolish a house next to them and use it for accessory parking as long as the use that they're in is permitted by right. And I'm wondering if at any point there was a discussion about requiring special use for all accessory parking lots in zoning areas with residential. So not business zoning, not the B1, B2, B3, B4, but the any of the zoning areas with residential, like neighborhood business, MOR. I'm trying to think if there would be any other. That might be the only two that have that kind of mixed use. I guess there is downtown. But so I'm wondering if there was a discussion about special use permits for parking lots, accessory parking lots.
Well, one item that came up was, would there be a development review board of parking lots? And we clarified the language so that even if, what the Presbyterian Church, if the project was just a parking lot, whether it was accessory, which would require a special use permit, would have to come to the development review board. So in the MOR zone, the development review board will see all parking, and it will have to meet those design guidelines that are developed specific to parking, as well as sections of our code that already deal with parking lot screening and geometrics. Your question about requiring a special use permit for any accessory parking, I don't think that came up specifically, but parking lots in the MOR district did get raised.
Actually, a principal use parking lot, if someone said, I want to go into the business of having a parking lot here, tear down a house, have a parking lot, and operate it as a business, it's actually a special use permit requirement. Yeah. So that would, as well as go to the DRB, would come to City Council for review and approval or disapproval.
But if I understand correctly, it's good to know. I didn't actually know that a parking lot would come before the Development Review Board. When I look at the design criteria, I don't think that parking, I see there's quite a bit about how it's structured, but there's not really a whole lot about parking and design criteria for parking. And I guess since that's one of the things that can happen on a lot, it's one of the things I think we should probably give quite a bit of attention to in this residential area. We met individually, and I know at that time we talked a little bit about the possibility in the future of designating the MOR or parts of it in the TIF district, and actually found out that parts of the MOR are in our TIF district, little pieces near the downtown. Is there, and at the time, what you said was that property values are actually rising in the area, not falling, so it's not a TIF eligible situation. Is it the case that property values in downtown were falling, and that's why we were able to designate that as a TIF? Or was it that we carved up downtown TIF in such a way that we captured property values that were low or deteriorating or falling in with property values that are on the rise? So I'm just trying to understand if there is a way to, in the future, perhaps engineer a TIF in this area where we could be providing, we would have a pot of gold for incentive, and we could maybe carve up areas that are falling in property values in with the MOR to make that happen. Is that something at all that we kind of dismissed it at the time, but is that a possibility?
It's possible that parts of it are showing a decline. The test is you need to show a decline in the increase. The increase in property values needs to be less than the balance of the city for, say, 4 out of 5 previous years. 23 years ago, we established the first TIF district downtown, and maybe some of that retail and other property development activity was declining, so it met that standard well at that time. TIF 2 would have been, I think, 10 years later, maybe, or that's 2009, so, yeah. Okay, so the late 1980s, that was established. And I think you're right, the boundaries of TIF districts do tend to match where you're finding those conditions. In addition to that test, and that's like an ultimate test, there's lots of other criteria that relate to condition of buildings, vacancies, site improvements, infrastructure or lack thereof. It's possible parts of the MOR district could qualify for TIF. I would say, and I've worked on establishing 5 TIF districts, I would say it's probably a pretty marginal TIF district. We could at least run the EAVs and see what that looks like. I mean, that's a pretty simple exercise.
Mhm. And the ability to actually expand the boundaries of an existing TIF district is quite difficult. It's basically starting from scratch. Is that correct?
It's like establishing a new one. I know that historically the city's really looked at TIF as a commercial tool, commercial development tool, and not so much a residential development tool, although it's done frequently in Chicago, for example. Our other taxing bodies are very reluctant many times to go along with the TIF district, so it really needs to be an area that needs that boost of a TIF district. And I guess I would encourage other incentive programs first before going that route.
Okay. And it was unclear, I guess, from your memo about whether or not forward a zoning administrator in including contiguous properties as properties that are adjacent to rather than contiguous to historic properties as being kind of eligible for review by historic preservation. Is that correct? Or is that something that came out of this that you're pursuing independently, or is that something you're wanting council direction on?
I'm comfortable with that interpretation. I think it was a good criticism, and we'll look at it more comprehensively next time. I will. I think it's a good idea. So I don't think there's any further direction needed on that.
Okay. And then this is my last. I guess it's common in question. It has to do, again, with the design criteria. And there were a couple of things in here. I was looking carefully at and I know we'll be seeing this again, but just to give you some direction now instead of in the 11th hour, from at least my opinion on the matter, is that when I think about area in the MOR, I don't think about it as let's keep everything the way it is. Certainly, I want to use historic preservation to preserve historic structures, and I want to use design criteria to prevent ugly, hideous buildings from going up. But I don't think about design criteria as a way to keep everything the way it is, and let's have a look, and let's make that look happen over and over again. There's some new buildings in the area with vinyl siding that kind of, and railings that are made out of metal that attempt to look like they belong in the area, and it's a flop. It's a Mickey Mouse version of what was there beforehand. And so I think in terms of architectural design, we're kind of in a place in history right now where we're looking backwards and we don't really have a lot of contemporary designs that are working. And I want to allow for a contemporary look and contemporary designs in the area. So when I see that the windows have to be taller than they are wide, or I see that there's a maximum percentage of wall face at 60%, I think perhaps there are contemporary designs that would really go against that way of thinking about that those are two things in particular that sounded to me like let's keep things the way they are rather than let's allow for contemporary design. If something's done tastefully and well, and it looks very different, and it's kind of future thinking, I would definitely be interested in seeing that, and I think it would enhance the area. So that's all for me.
Other questions? Not, the motion would be in order.
Move approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Ms. Pat?
I have some amendments I would like to propose. Pass out copies and take them individually. The first is I move to amend the motion to delete Section 3 of the proposed ordinance, which reads, Section 3J, parking located below a principal structure shall be allowed in the MOR district in accordance with the provisions of Article 8 of this ordinance and the provisions of the MOR design guidelines provided for in Section 1112J.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion, Ms. Pat?
If I could speak to it. The original suggestion to, I believe, was for underground parking, the idea being that people don't like to look at parking lots behind buildings, and so if the parking were a completely enclosed underground garage, that in some people's minds that would be an improvement over what we have now. This doesn't say that, and this doesn't call for that. This just lifts one of the restrictions in the MOR district that's been in existence throughout the life of the district, allows the parking to be a portion of the first floor of the building. Since it does not accomplish the one potential good purpose of concealing views of the cars, I don't see why we'd want to do it. And it also carries two very big negatives. One is that allowing parking under the building eliminates the number of accessible housing units that would result from any new construction. And that's one thing about the new construction of multifamily housing, no matter where it is and what anybody thinks about it, who does it, whether it's good or bad, the one good that comes out of new construction of multifamily housing is an increase in the stock of wheelchair accessible housing units, unless most or all of the footprint of the building is parking, and then we lose that. The other thing, and this is, it's hard to address here without design guidelines, but I don't see how a building can be compatible with the surrounding uses if a significant portion of the first floor is a parking lot. Maybe once we have some more specific design guidelines, someone could show us what can be. But we heard tonight people citing examples of buildings with partially submerged parking, and in all those cases, I think those are very undesirable. They would not be compatible at all with the Green or Elm Street corridor, and frankly, I don't even think it's possible. But if we leave this in, what I think we will see are the types of parking lots that we see, that you can see around town, where you may not be able to see the cars from Green Street, but the next door neighbors are going to open up their dining room window, and what they're going to see is a parking lot, and the people in the back are going to see a parking lot. The screening requirements we have for the 3 feet of little bushes that allegedly keep headlights of cars from shining in people's windows is not in any way, shape, or form comparable to something being an enclosed garage where you can't see the cars at all. So to join me in making this change, and if you really think there's something possible that can be done in the way of parking, working with design criteria, and if you don't care about the accessibility issue, then let's at least wait till we have some design criteria so we can see what we're talking about.
Yes, I think that the comment about accessible units is important. The other arguments I don't understand, like that cars underground with screening or partially submerged still have headlights that go into people's windows, and that is the case for any parking lot on the property. And now we're looking at people putting parking behind, which is contiguous with somebody's backyard, and side lots, which is also contiguous with people's yards. And so I really don't, I see only emerging parking rather than having surface parking, because you at least have green space, as long as it's done safely and there's screening. So I will be voting no on this amendment.
Is there further discussion?
I have a question about the accessibility issue. I know that there are apartment houses being built around town that have the kind of parking that Mrs. Pat is interested in preventing, and I'm sure they're subject to the ADA and have to provide accessible housing. How are they meeting that requirement?
Well, it depends if the parking's underneath the entire building. If it is, I think what they've done in some cases is had those units accessible from the parking, and that's probably not as desirable as having street access. Suppose there's a way to have both accessible units and parking if it's placed in the rear of the unit, as we envisioned with this amendment, and hopefully those accessible units could be in the front of the building. That way you get the hidden parking as well as accessible units.
So basically, if they're doing it, they're still going ahead and making room to have some accessible units there on the ground floor.
And that's exactly the kind of detail that the Development Review Board would be able to request and make revisions to.
But basically, when they're going up, the owners are figuring out some way to fit in accessible units so they can comply with the ADA. Okay, thanks.
Yes, I'll be supporting this motion. I think that the issue of accessible units is an important one when you're looking at the multifamily structures. One of the complaints that we've had in the past, this was when we've considered various issues on accessible housing, including visitability and the sorts of issues that start to address, though don't completely address the need for accessible housing, is the issue of right now, even when when an apartment building is made that comports with or claims to comport with ADA and Illinois accessible environmental requirements, the one or two apartments that are accessible are the garage, or basically the garage apartments that, and Lester Pritchard, I remember complaining, and other people also with who are disabled, complaining about the fact that, so basically their accessibility, or their one choice or two choices for an accessible apartment, are right where all the gas fumes come in. And there's also not an ability to mix as well with other people in the apartment building, because it's basically, oh, this is the handicapped apartment, because it's only one, that if it's only one apartment that has to be built that's handicap accessible, well, it's the one that's right next to all of the underground or partially submerged parking. And so I think, not only is it not as desirable for the one or two apartments that are accessible, but it also reduces the total number of accessible apartments that could be located at in an apartment building. So that the proposed or the suggested benefits, which we haven't seen yet because there aren't design review criteria that would assure a certain amount of extra green space or that sort of thing, police submerged parking, I think is, not only is that not seen because we don't have design review criteria, but the negative of not having potentially more accessible apartments on the first floor on the ground level, I think makes this idea of getting rid of the possibility of partially submerged spaces important to do, so that we can provide as much accessible apartment units as possible. So for that reason, I'll be voting yes on this proposal.
I had a question about this. Was the intent here to be able to allow for more green space and to hide the parking in what could be a sensitive area to try? We've had a lot of discussion in not just along the Green Street corridor, High Elm Street, but throughout that whole neighborhood about parking in the backyards and being unsightly. Was it to be able to hide some of the parking, or was it to be able to add additional parking, or a combination of the two?
think it's a little bit of both. I know the reason it came up in discussion is in one of the proposals that we had at the Development Review Board for 701 West Green. One of the questions early on in that process was if I designed a building where cars could pull in off the back alley and pull under the building in the form of a garage, and the front half of the building still had 2 units there, but the back half was more of a garage, can I do that? And the answer under the current regulations was no. So it really started us thinking about, well, what could be some of the advantages of parking underneath a building if it's, and we realized the reason why the restriction was in there was probably to avoid the appearance of the stilt building. So we thought there's ways that could be designed and look okay, especially in the case where a car is accessing off of in the case of 701 and into something that looks like a garage. The developer of that project also mentioned that it would be desirable to have some of his parking spaces that were covered or in a garage, and that would be more attractive to a tenant. Try and get some of the spaces either out of the backyard. It could also be a way to provide more spaces for some of these projects that are seem to be underparked, and then also added slight amenity for some of the residents that probably want to pay more for it but wish to have it. But again, I do realize it is hard to envision without a drawing, a couple drawings in front of you that says this is okay, this is not okay.
Could you give me an example of a building in the city of Urbana that would be okay, that would meet what you imagine to be the design requirements for parking underneath a principal structure?
I can give you an example. There's out on West Washington, on the south side, there are a number of apartments. I went out knocking on doors out there that have garages underneath. They're townhouse-style apartments. They have garages underneath the apartments.
Excuse me, 100 block of West Washington. Do you mean East
Washington?
East Washington.
I'm sorry. That's right, East Washington.
Garages
So,
you're talking
right,
about.
it's just directly south of the Home Run Deli.
Okay. Is the New Yorker, would you say the New Yorker is or is not?
No.
No, because...
Well, yeah, I mean, a large portion of that is visible from the street, a large portion of the parking. I believe it's partially it wasn't the idea that was presented for that proposal at 701.
Thank you.
Other questions or discussion? If there are no other discussion, all in favor of the amendment to delete that particular section, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
That motion fails. Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I'm going to skip to D because there's different language that's on this page for number 2. And the motion to amend basically changes the requirement for a simple majority to a 2/3 majority vote by the Development Review Board to approve a, well, actually for all of their actions for approving site plans.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion?
Just speaking to the motion, the review board be unanimous, and that was deliberately placed in there to ensure that there was some protection for serious consideration of all of the requirements. There was a lot of debate about whether over the years of the Development Review Board had to be unanimous in a final decision or unanimous on each of the different criteria that they were evaluating. Somehow all that just got tossed out with this new proposal to make it a simple majority vote. I think that considering that this is a final decision the Development Review Board makes and that it is a body of 7 people, one or more of whom may have a conflict of interest on every single case before them, it's especially important to ensure that we do not have important decisions like this being made by a small number of people, and the way it's proposed now, 3 people will make the decision as to whether or not a New Yorker-style underground parking is or is not compatible, or whether design criteria that are not mandated but are just guidelines with, I think, a protection of the public interest would be to require a two-thirds majority of this body for approval of any site plan.
Further discussion? There's no further discussion. All
Mr.
in-
Mayor?
Yes.
I'm going to move to defer this till next week so I can have further time to consider this particular consideration of this amendment. Ultimately, I'm going to ask to defer the whole ordinance until next week so I can have further time to
2 weeks.
discuss
2
it.
weeks.
That's right, until the next city council meeting. But I'd also like to defer this amendment if there's no...
I'll withdraw the amendment if we're deferring the ordinance.
Okay, thanks.
Amendment's been withdrawn. Further discussion, Ms. Pat, did you have
Well, if we're not going to take this up for 2 weeks, I'll just wait on all that. Thank you.
Ms. Wyman?
I guess I won't make this motion now because if we're going to defer the whole ordinance, I'll let council members have the 2 weeks to consider this as well. But just as a note, on page 6 of the ordinance, for council members, the proposed ordinance, under section C, membership, talks about membership of the Development Review Board. That's page 6 of the ordinance. Letter or item C1D states as a member, an owner of property in the MOR mixed office residential zoning district is one of the members, and when this comes back to us in 2 weeks, I'll be suggesting we amend that to read instead a resident of the MOR mixed office residential zoning district. That is for item D, just for point of information.
Mr. Mayor, I didn't intend to cut off discussion of this. In fact, I'd like to have an opportunity to discuss all the potential amendments. I can educate myself on the various pros and cons over the next 2 weeks. And I didn't necessarily even intend to cut off discussion of the remaining amendments. But I think it would be helpful if we could go ahead and discuss the amendments now, so that during the intervening period, I at least will have an opportunity to educate myself further.
Yeah, I agree with you, particularly, if there are a number of amendments which may relate to one another. We'd like to see the whole package of them and have an idea of what the whole thing's going to look like in final form, rather than just agreeing to one and then not realizing that another one's coming that might relate to it. Ms. Wyman, I appreciate you bringing to our attention the fact that you were planning on suggesting an amendment to membership. Pat, did you have any other amendments that you wanted to let council know about at this time?
Oh, sure, why not? I mean, I'm sure they'll all be defeated because I don't think that, I don't think the interest of Mayor Markland's vision of this being a historic corridor, an elegant entryway connecting historic campus to historic downtown is what is the interest of this city council. But I don't know, maybe this one's pretty weak and doesn't really do much, so maybe you'll go along with it. Basically, it's despite the tremendous interest in getting the staff off of making these decisions, having the students, the proposal here still includes the staff making, or actually the zoning administrator making determinations of changes in codes and parking requirements and all sorts of things for adaptive reuse. And this proposed amendment would clarify that when the zoning administrator, in his or her opinion, decides that the adaptive reuse really is totally changing the property, that then the Development Review Board can have a look at it. And I think the example is, one example, property 308 West Green, technically that building was not new construction, which is why when that building was built, it did not need to comply with fair housing requirements for providing housing for people with disabilities, and there are no accessible units in that building. The building was stripped down to its bones and then rebuilt. If if a house is taken down to almost nothing, but it's not technically torn down, and then it's added to and completely changed, I think that should have the same scrutiny as new construction and should not be treated in the same way as reuse, which is intended to preserve the existing structure. So this was the language that the zoning administrator suggested, and if you want to look at that for next week, or for 2 weeks from now, and see if that's something that you would support, I would appreciate that.
Chandler?
I've told Ms. Pat this already, that I support this particular initiative. So maybe you won't lose all your amendments, but I did want to alert the council to an amendment that is very simple, that I will propose in 2 weeks, and that will be in the same section that Ms. Wyman mentioned, membership 1, and she mentioned D, this would be G, an owner of a local business, and I will be proposing that we change that to an owner of a local small business with fewer than 40 employees. I am, in the meantime, going to the Small Business Development Center in town and see if I can get a better understanding of what is a small business and try to have some criteria for that number. But I think the idea behind that, the addition of a small business, or a local business, which I support, is that there would be someone with the same kind of background as a business that might be moving into the area, and so therefore bring a certain expertise and understanding of what that business needs. I think somebody from, say, Carl Foundation Hospital, or somebody from Flex and Gate, or might really not have the same kind of understanding of what it means to try to fit in a residential area and to conduct business in a neighborhood setting. And so I feel strongly that we should further define that as a small local business. And I believe that was the intent of that in just the discussions that I've read, but it isn't stipulated clearly. So I will be bringing that, and you can chew on that for 2 weeks.
Well, if there are no other discussion at this time, Mr. Otto?
No. I move to defer this until the next meeting of the City Council.
Second.
Motion and a second, will 2 weeks.
It's buried under all the stuff.
Okay, we're at item 3 under new business. It's an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO 31, Local 1331, for the term beginning July 1, 2003 through June 30th, 2006. Did you want to kick this off? Are there any questions? No questions, a motion for in order?
Move approval.
Second.
Motion a second, any discussion? For no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth? Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Huth?
Yes.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 6 ayes. And finally, a related ordinance, an ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance 2003, should be 2003, the 2003 AFSCME agreement. This would be the current fiscal year. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Huth?
Yes.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Mayor Satterthwaite?
Yes. Motion carries with 7 ayes. And there being no further business to come before us this evening, stands adjourned.